First tables I'll need are the ones.
Students and doctoral students to our second webinar with Professor Eric Uslaner, one of the most outstanding researchers of social trust, the author of comparative analysis of social capital, in particular in the context of corrupt behaviors. Professor's works are widely published in the prestigious publishing houses such as Cambridge University Press, Routledge, and of course top-ranking academic journals such as Political Science Quarterly, Political Psychology, Political Communication. Professor Eric Uslaner is a researcher at the University of Maryland, College Park in the United States. He has been recognized many times as one of the top 100 thought leaders in trustworthy business behavior in the United States. And he is also one of the most cited researchers in social sciences field. Thanks to the Metropolitan Fund for supporting science, so we can organize a few webinars conducted by Professor Eric Uslaner. And today's meeting is on the moral foundations of trust, is the part of the wider project, Trust as a Value, Corruption, Inequality, and Social Capital. During the lecture, questions and comments are very welcome at any time of the meeting. You can raise your hand or just write something in the chat and I will read it. Dear Rick, thank you for accepting my invitation, and I am very happy you are here sharing your thoughts and ideas with us. So I think we can start.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction, and welcome to everyone. Agnes has told you a bit about me. I've been working on trust now for quite a number of years, and it started when I was working on what was most of my early career, which was based on studying the US Congress. And I saw that there was an increasing hostility in the US Congress among people, particularly people of opposing parties. And I was wondering why that was the case. And some of the people who were studying Congress were saying, well, some of the institutional rules changed, which meant that people no longer could rely upon each other quite so much. And I found that explanation lacking, because I felt that Congress reflected what was going on in the larger society. And my argument became the reason why you couldn't get cooperation in Congress is because the society, members of society, were less trusting of each other. So that led me to try to associate the decline in friendships and increase in partisan hostility in Congress to the decline of trust in the country. And in 1993, I published a book on Congress that tried to explain this with the level of trust being an independent variable. I didn't really know much about the literature on trust at that point, and didn't until Bob Putnam invited me to a conference on social capital because of my work on trust in Congress. At that point, I figured out I needed to learn something more about trust at the individual level and began reading up on the literature, including his own work. And that led me to come up with my own conception of trust, which turned out to be fundamentally different from not only his conception of trust, but from most of the other conceptions of trust at the individual level. Putnam's argument was that if I trusted people I know, I would also trust people I don't know. That trust in that sense was transitive. And I wasn't sure I believed that. So the first story I'll tell you a couple of stories here. I trust my wife. You'll all be absolutely thrilled to know that. And I presume you all trust either your spouses or your partners or your friends. But that doesn't tell me anything about whether I trust people who are close to me. I mean, who are different from me. And the group I like to tell about is Martians. None of us know Martians. How would we know if we were ever to trust people who are that different from ourselves? Well, it can't be because we have trusted people we know. Because trusting people we know sort of comes naturally. And it also can occur for specific purposes. So you may trust me to give a talk, but you probably shouldn't trust me to paint your house or to perform operations on you. Hold on, let me get it. And if I do that, if I try to paint your house, then you'd make a mistake. So I call that type of trust, trusting people to do specific things. I call that strategic trust. This is what Russell Hardin's idea of trust is. A trusts B to do X. There's another form of trust that's also different. It's what Toshio Yamagishi calls particularized trust. And that's when you only trust people who are very much like yourself. So if I trust my wife, that doesn't mean I'll trust people from different backgrounds. I'll trust Martians. I'll trust people I've never met. And particularized trust can either be related to generalized trust or completely negative towards it. So if I trust people who are different from myself, I'm certainly going to trust people who are similar. But if I only trust people who are similar, I may very much dislike people who are different. And this is one of the problems that we're confronting in today's world, where we have so much negativity and exclusion in the notion of social cohesion, which I'll talk about a bit later on. So these are three different types of trust, and they're unrelated to each other. I'll give you just one more story on particularized trust and then move on to how we conceptualize trust. Some years ago, our family used to take trips to the Delaware shore during the summer. And on the way to the shore, there were fruit stands run by individuals who would leave their fruit out, and you would have to pay for it without them being there. When they put their fruit out, that was trust in people that they didn't know, they would never see. If you stopped paying, they wouldn't leave the fruit out anymore. So this has to depend upon some sort of general sense of trust for them to do it. But they could stop it at any point, and that's based upon experience. Okay, if moralistic or generalized trust is trust in people who are different from yourself, where does that come from? And my argument is multifaceted. First of all, you learn it at an early age. You learn it from your parents. It can be affected by early life experiences, your childhood, maybe even elementary or high school. But once you develop this sense of trust, it stays with you for your entire life. Unless something absolutely terrible happens to the entire society. Not just to you. I could come and punch you in the face right now. And that should lead you not to trust me, but it shouldn't lead you to distrust other people. Now, if you live in a world where there's a tremendous amount of conflict, where nobody gets along with anybody else, that can lead to a lower sense of trust. But not individual relationships. Your house can be robbed, someone can hit you, you can have bad personal experiences, but that should not affect your overall level of generalized trust. Unless you believe that everyone would behave in the same way. So this is a sense that most people can be trusted. Now, this same sort of trust is also different. And can we get tables? No, I'll just talk about this. There's some people say components to generalized trust. First, most people can be trusted. Secondly, most people are fair and they would not take advantage of you. And third, most people would try to be helpful. Morris Rosenberg, who was one of the early developers of the concept of generalized trust, said these three were all components of generalized trust. And he formed a scale with these three survey questions about trust, fairness, and helpfulness. I disagree. In 2016, the American National Election Studies always asked this question about trust. And they also sat some people down and they asked them, what do you mean when you hear these questions? And these were focus groups where people actually sat around and talked what they meant by these questions. And overall, about 3/4 of the people said that the generalized trust question meant to them a general sense that people are good. Fairness didn't require that same sense that people are good. It just required the notion that people wouldn't cheat you. And most people believe that other people are honest. So only about half the people said that fairness reflected a general sense of goodness in people. And finally, helpfulness is rather routine. If I came to your city, got lost, and wanted to know where a bank was, and stopped someone on the street and said, where's the nearest bank so I can get some money? Now, overwhelmingly, people would tell me. They would say, oh, it's right around the corner. It doesn't cost them anything. They don't have to put any moral code into telling me where it is. So only about 1/4 of people believed that being helpful was an indication linking you to some other people in some moral sense. So the generalized trust question is different from helpfulness and it's different from fairness. Now, here's where we get to the difference with Putnam on another way. Can we get these tables 4 and tables 2? Okay. Let's see if I can get rid of this. Okay. On table 4 and table 2, I look at how Putnam considers trust. Putnam considers trust to be part of a general notion of social capital. And I'm not sure that I understand what social capital is all about. Because it includes, as you can see here, belonging to groups, belonging to associations, sports clubs, cultural associations. It includes trust in government, confidence in the parliament, the police, It includes membership in political organizations, and it includes honesty. And this is from a study that two Danish friends of mine did. And what these numbers are, if you have some statistics, there's something called factor analysis. If you don't, let me just explain it very briefly. The things that have the same numbers in the same columns form one specific component of social capital. That's what this analysis tells you. So you see here that trust is all the way by itself. Belonging to cultural or youth organizations form another component. Government confidence is a third component. Belonging to a political organization is a fourth component. And honesty is a fifth component. And the way this technique works, these components are all either independent of each other or may even be negatively correlated. So if you belong to a political party, chances are you may not have a whole lot of trust in members of the other political party, which is why these signs are positive and this one is negative. These are not positively related. So if you belong to one type of political organization, you may not have faith in people who are different from yourself overall. Confidence in the parliament, confidence in the government also is very different from social trust. In the United States, Democrats have a lot more faith in government now than they did when Donald Trump was in office. So confidence in government changes from year to year. But social trust pretty well stays the same throughout most of your lifetime. And at the individual level, these confidences in government and confidences in parliament are basically uncorrelated, sometimes even negatively correlated with social trust. So this notion of social capital being a single idea doesn't always hold. Next table, please. Oops. Here are some other things that Putnam says are all part of the same general notion. And it's where I decided, when I heard him at a talk at the World Bank that I was invited to, when I decided that I didn't agree with him. He argued in his book, Bowling Alone, that if you belong to a choral society, you're going to be more trusting of other people, and that if you have picnics or dinner parties, you're also going to be more trusting. Well, I've never invited anyone I didn't know to a picnic or to a dinner party. So you can see here that this dimension of entertaining people in my own home or a dinner party, playing cards or sending a greeting card, is a completely independent dimension. It isn't connected to almost anything else you can do. It's not connected to attending a sporting event or a concert. It's not connected to joining a club or attending a meeting. It's not connected to social events like going camping. It's not connected to honesty or other sports activities. It's certainly not connected to going bowling, which doesn't seem to be connected to almost anything else other than playing golf. So the idea that people are bowling alone isn't such a bad thing. You know why people are bowling alone now? Because they're probably not bowling much at all. They're doing other things to occupy their time. They may be going to concerts, and they may be going to church or clubs or working. So all these things tend to be rather different. Okay, this leads to, we're finished with this now. I can just talk for a little while. Where does trust come from? Well, I said you learn it from your parents. What do they teach you? They teach you a couple of things. First of all, that the world is a good place. There are all sorts of people in it, and it's good that there are all sorts of people. You're better off if you know people of multiple backgrounds than if you just know people who look all the same as you are. That's one. Number two is when you live in a more diverse area, chances are you're also living in what I consider to be the fundamental aspect of generalized trust, in a more equal area. The single biggest driver of generalized trust, in my analysis, is the level of equality in a society. So, in societies that have a greater degree of equality, you also have more generalized trust. What countries are these? Anyone want to guess? Okay, Susanna, of all the former Yugoslav, parts of former Yugoslavia, what country, which one do you think is the most equal?
Um, I think Slovenia.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Do you think the level of trust is higher in Slovenia than it is elsewhere?
I hope so.
Yeah, it is. Because Slovenia, even under Yugoslavia, had a lot of contact with the rest of Europe, when much of Yugoslavia had less contact. And the most trusting countries in the world, and this shouldn't be completely surprising, are in the Nordic countries. Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, and then also the Netherlands, and not Scandinavia, but now more and more Australia. These are countries that are much more equal and have always been more equal. And let me just tell a story about Sweden here. Sweden, actually, in all of the Nordic countries, are known for what are called universalistic social welfare policies. So all that it takes to live in one of these countries is living there. If you live in this country, you are automatically entitled to benefits from that country. You're considered to be a member of that society as long as you accept being a member of that society. And so these countries give universal social welfare benefits. I'll tell two quick stories here. Number one is I gave a talk in Uppsala some years ago, and the university set me up with a tour of their museum. And the director of the museum showed me some of the paintings in the museum, and one of them had the king and his court in the 13th century. So who was a member of the king's court? Well, of course, there were other nobility. There was the landed gentry. There was also the clergy. But there was a third group that the king was meeting with as a member of his court, the peasants. In the 13th century in Sweden, the peasants were a member of the king's court. That just doesn't happen in most other countries. You just don't have the peasants being members of the court, the king's court. But even in the 13th century, it happened in Sweden. So that was a sign that even though Sweden wasn't very rich in the 13th century, it was much more equal than many of the other countries. In fact, in all the Nordic countries, there is something called Jante law. And Jante law is an idea saying if you are rich, you don't brag about it. You keep it a secret. Because if you brag about it, that tells people you think that you are better than they are. And you're not supposed to do that. Everyone is supposed to be of equal worth in society. So when I was visiting Gothenburg, I had dinner at the house of another political scientist who I'm sure wasn't that tremendously rich, but his wife was a world famous novelist. And she made a lot of money. And she bought him his own private sauna. But he put it in the basement so only his close friends or good visitors ever got to see it. I got to see his sauna. I didn't go in it, but I got to see it. But he kept it in his basement so ordinary visitors to the house wouldn't see it. And this is part of this notion of equality that underlies generalized trust. And one of the things about equality and generalized trust is that they are both what I call sticky. And what do I mean by sticky? They don't change that much over time. So when they don't change that much over time, countries that were trusting back when the first surveys were done, back in the 1970s or 1980s, are still trusting today. Now, we don't have any surveys going back much later than that. We have some German surveys going back to the 1940s, but nobody else was doing surveys other than the United States until about the 70s or 80s. But we do know quite a bit about equality. We have lots of good measures of equality. And one of the standard measures that people use is the percentage of farms in a nation that were owned by families, as opposed to owned by big estate owners. And this explains why some countries are more equal than others. The countries with the greatest percentage of family farms, anyone want to guess which ones they were? You should be able to guess by now. The Nordic countries. And this will surprise some people because it's now become far more unequal than it used to be. My country, the United States. In fact, there was a French sociologist named Werner Sombart who wrote a book, Why There's No Socialism in the United States. And his argument was they never had a feudal system. Whereas Britain never had a feudal system, but has always had big estates where large landowners held most of the property. And even now in England, individual people can't buy lifetime property for their homes. They can buy a 99-year lease, but after 99 years, your successors have to give it back to whoever originally owned it. I mean, my wife and I here, and I presume most people in Poland own their own homes. And you can give it to your children, your grandchildren, your friends, you can do whatever you want with it. But you can't in England. So this aspect of equality is fundamental to generalized trust. Now, let me just mention a few of the consequences and also where you don't get it. Where you don't get generalized trust is from government. Well, you can get generalized trust from government if government enacts policies that are universalistic, like they have in Sweden. But there's a problem. You generally need trust to begin with to be able to get equality. So it's a reciprocal relationship between equality and generalized trust. And government policies generally will not produce equality unless there's some degree of equality to begin with. Now people can say, well, one way to get trust is to enforce it. So can a court system produce equality? Think so? Not really. And the reason is, if the court system is biased, then you won't get very much equality. You know the country that has the most courts in the world? Russia. You think that Vladimir Putin is going to share his wealth or his friends' wealth with ordinary Russians? Nope. So simply having courts doesn't guarantee that justice will be fair. What does matter, and it matters for corruption, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is the fairness of the legal system, but that again depends upon the level of trust. So government is generally not the source of trust. Now, let me see what else I need to get through here. Okay, let me just move on and talk to just some of the other things that I've worked on. I'll just mention something that very briefly. After I wrote about how I differed with Putnam on whether joining an organization leads to trust, whether trusting people you know leads to trust, I read another article he published that got very, very widespread fame, and that was on diversity. He argued that it's easier to trust people we know than to people who are like us than people who are unlike us. And there's a long psychology literature. I presume some of you are in psychology, and you know some of the literature in psychology, particularly by people like Marilyn Brewer, who say it's so much easier to trust people who are like ourselves. And that's true, except that it's really important to trust people who are unlike ourselves. Where does this come from? Does it come from the fact that we live in a diverse society that makes us less trusting? That's what Putnam argues. And I say he's completely wrong on that. Because living in a diverse society should be a sign that you do trust people who are different from yourself. Where I live now has people of absolutely every background. There are people of every religion. This area is very, very heavily Jewish and Hindu, groups that tend to be more trusting. It's very heavily Black, very heavily Hispanic. And people choose to live and interact with people of different backgrounds. that directly contradicts what Putnam is arguing. So what matters is not so much diversity, but residential segregation. And residential segregation and diversity are not the same thing. You can have a very diverse area, but people can either live next to people of different backgrounds or live separate from people of different backgrounds. If they live next to people of different backgrounds, that will be a sign that they become more that they're more trusting. It won't make them more trusting. It will reflect their initial decisions as to where to live. But if they live in segregated neighborhoods, two things will happen. First of all, it will reflect the fact that they don't want to live near people of different backgrounds, and it will isolate them from ever coming into contact with people of different backgrounds. And when that happens, that will create real problems. And when it creates real problems, people who are segregated will tend to have worse life outcomes. They will have higher crime rates, less education, less public services, and will be in situations where they are very, very much unequal to people from the majority group. And I can get into, if people have questions, what some of these outcomes are. But let me now move on before we take a short break or I change my topic to what I'm currently working on, which I'm waiting to hear any day now about the final decision on this. I'm working on a book called National Cohesion, National Identity and Political Polarization. And I'm in the final stages of discussion with Oxford University Press about publication. And what national identity is what makes someone a true Pole or a true Serbian, a true American, or whatever. And there are a couple of different ways we can think about this. One way is an exclusivist argument, which is, do you have to be born in Poland? Do you have to be white? Do you have to be Catholic? Do you have to have Polish ancestry? Or can you come to a country, emigrate to that country, and say, as long as I adopt Polish customs, that's good enough. And people who live in countries with inclusivist national identities tend to be more trusting and tend to have better feelings towards people of different backgrounds and have better lives overall. People with more exclusivist orientations say, you have to be the same group that I am. And if we can get to that table I just sent you, what happens in these countries, okay, let's go down to further down. Oh, maybe, hold on, let me see. No, maybe it's a different one. Sorry, I'll just summarize it. This comes later on. This is, do you have a table with the graphs or not? No,
This
let's
one?
forget it. No, don't worry about it. I'll just summarize it.
Okay.
I had it somewhere here. No, okay, well, I'll just summarize it. Countries with more exclusivist national identities tend to be more likely to vote for right-wing exclusivist parties. We see this in Poland today with Jobbik. We see it in Hungary with Fidesz. We see it in Austria with the FPO. We see it in France with Le Pen. We see it in Britain with Brexit, because the people who voted for Brexit also are very much opposed to immigration. And we see it in the United States with the Republican Party of Donald Trump. What happens in these countries is that the major issue becomes not one necessarily of left-right, but becomes one of immigration. Who gets to live there and who qualifies for benefits? So if you are not willing to consider people of different backgrounds to be equal to yourself, then you are not willing to give them benefits, and you think that you should only give benefits to people who look like yourself. And this is sort of interesting. I'll just summarize this and then take a break for a little while or have some questions. In the United States, we have this level of political polarization where views on immigration are highly correlated with views on everything else. So the Republicans don't like minorities. They don't like Hindus. They don't like Hispanics. They don't like black people. They don't like Asians. And they're not willing to give them benefits. But they also don't want to give benefits to people like us, people, academics, because they consider us to be weak. We don't work with our hands. And this is correlated in the United States and Britain with an overall left-right ideology. But in Poland and in Hungary, you have exactly the opposite. You don't want to give benefits to people who are different, but you're willing to give very generous benefits to people like yourself. And then one of the other countries I examined is Taiwan, where benefits aren't really the issue. The only issue that really matters in Taiwan is whether you identify as Taiwanese or Chinese. You're looking as if you sort of, I guess you're looking to sort of draw this up, or well, basically that's my argument, that the United States is far more polarized on across the board than other places are. So let me just end with that for the time being and open it up for some questions.
So I have a question.
Please.
So you said that it is better for society to trust people who are unrelated with us. Like,
Yeah.
we trust people related to us, and it's better for society to trust people who we don't know. So it's the same. Would you say it's the same as Putnam was writing about bridging and bonding social capital?
Well, he actually stole those terms from Michael Woodward at the World Bank.
Yeah.
And what Yamagishi argues is that if you only trust people like yourself, then that's not going to be positive. That's going to be negative. And Nancy Rosenblum, who's a political theorist at Harvard, wrote a book in which she talked about this notion that trusting people like yourself will lead to trusting people who are different as sort of an airy liberalism that has no real life foundation. So that if I trust my wife, that's not going to make me trust black people. There's no way you can jump from one to the other automatically. And that's what Putnam said. Putnam said if you join a group, you'll be more trusting of everybody. But people don't go bowling with people of different groups. They don't go on picnics with people they don't know. You're not going to stop a random person on the street, particularly of different background, and say, come to my house for dinner Saturday night. Or let's go on a picnic together. Or let's go to a concert together. And one of the things I found out in my first book, The Moral Foundations of Trust, who joins choral societies? Two sorts of people who are related. People who like to sing and people who are looking for dates. And chances are when you're looking for a date, you're going to look for someone you like rather than someone who's completely different. Now, I have a rather unusual situation. I met someone from a completely different background to myself. She came from a wealthy English family of a different religion with less education than I did. I met her standing in line 38 years ago at Heathrow Airport, and we've been married for 38 years. That's highly unusual. A year later, I also spoke to a graduate student I didn't know, sitting in a dorm in Indiana University, far from where either of us lived. I asked him to read a section of his newspaper. I'm originally from New York. He was reading the New York Times. I asked him if he was from the New York area. He was. He's of my same background. 40 years later, he's still my best friend. He lives 20 miles away from me. He and his wife live 20 miles away from me. But again, that's unusual. The chances that I would have met someone of my exact same background in a place quite a distance away from where we were, who was studying in the same field, and met him at random, and we became such close friends. I mean, we do have some disagreements. We root for different baseball teams. And he left academics to go into law. But aside from that, generally, we don't. I have another paper that I can send to anyone who wants it, which is about talking to strangers. There is a very famous journalist, Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote a book called Talking to Strangers. And I was asked to write a paper on talking to strangers. And you know what happens when you talk to strangers? Most of the time, nothing. You can ask them for directions. Do you ever go to a store? Do you talk to the clerks for an extended period of time? Generally not. You generally have them ring up what you bought, and you're gone. That's the end of the conversation. So most of our interactions with strangers, people who are different from ourselves, are inconsequential. Most of my connections at my job at the university with people who were different from myself were with people who cleaned my office. They would come in, take out the garbage, and that would be the end of the story. I have no idea who takes out my garbage now. The only thing I know about the people who mow my lawn is one of their predecessors once stole a radio from my son's car. So most of the time, we don't have that much interaction with people who are fundamentally different from ourselves. We should try, but we don't always do a good enough job.
So it's possible to trust people we don't know, or is impossible?
Oh, it is possible, but it's not going to come from experience. It's going to come from what our parents taught us. And I was very fortunate in that, particularly my mother would always teach me that it didn't matter what you look like, what you believed, where you lived, what you did for a living. All you had to do was be a nice person and someone who didn't want to hurt other people.
And I have another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
About this general trust, because it's whether general trust create equality, or whether equality creates this general trust.
Both, but you need some degree of equality to get trust to begin with. Because if you don't have some degree of equality, you're not going to be able to trust people who are different from yourself. In a highly stratified society, you're going to believe that people who are different from yourself are in some way bad. They don't have your same background. You may even view them as an enemy. And this is why, for example, Taiwanese identity is so important in Taiwan. Even people whose families came from China now identify as Taiwanese because they regard China as the enemy, someone who's trying to take over Taiwan. And that's a real problem. So you can, in Taiwan, you're allowed to identify. And one other thing that happens in many societies, certainly happens in the United States, and it happens in Sweden as well. And I'll give you a quick story on Sweden. You can migrate to a country, and this is where countries that have an inclusivist sense of national identity. So if all you have to do is say, I'm a Pole, I'm a Swede, I'm an American, then that's positive. So some years ago when I was in Gothenburg, I had a couple of taxi drivers. And I asked them, do you consider yourself Swedes? And they said, well, not really. I'm still an Afghan. I'm still from Nigeria. But my kids consider themselves to be Swedish. And this is what happens in the United States. Immigrants from other countries still think of themselves as residents of that country. But their kids come to identify as Americans. Particularly if, say, my son had a friend in high school who was Chinese. And he had a Chinese name, but he never used it. And he went to college in the United States. And I'm sure when people talk to him, he's now just Daniel. I'm sure he never uses his Chinese name. So my quick story on Sweden, to finish it up. So I said that these two guys, taxi drivers, I asked them what they liked and disliked about Sweden. And what they disliked was obvious. Anyone who's ever been to Sweden knows it's the weather. The weather's terrible in Sweden. It's cold. It gets dark after lunch. Sometimes while you're still eating lunch. You can slip on the ice easily. What did they like? Their kids went to university for free. And they both said it without being prompted. So what they liked is how Sweden treated their family. And that's very positive. What else can I?
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, Susanna asked a very interesting questions. Is it possible to trust people we don't know? But well, I think it's a kind of trap in the society because having a low level of trust, we are immersed in the specific culture and history, and we are behaving by and learning from people who don't know, who don't trust others. So how we can break it? As you told us, you were teaching by your mom, and you tried to trust others, but in the whole society, do you have any idea how to break it?
Well, to give you the same story I'm going to talk about for corruption. Education. The more education one has, the more one is exposed to different sorts of people. When you go to university, you're going to do two things. You're going to meet people from different backgrounds, I would hope. Does your university have foreign students? Do you know any?
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah. But also, when you're in university now, I don't know what the Polish system is, but in the American universities, you're required to take courses that teach you about other cultures. And when you learn about other cultures, you tend to appreciate them a lot more. And you understand where they're coming from, and that not everyone has to agree with you. And so education is key for this. It's also key for corruption. There's also, at times, if you get a political movement that pushes for equality, that can also help. The problem we have in the United States now is that the country is so divided. Half of the country believes in equality, believes that people from other backgrounds are good, and the other half believes in inequality. I mean, they don't believe that inequality per se is good, but they're not willing to pursue any policies that produce equality. And they also worry that white Christian evangelicals are becoming a minority. A friend named Robert Jones at the Public Religion Research Institute has written a couple of books on this. And he's a former evangelical who now is very, very anti-evangelical and believes that we should try to be as inclusive as we possibly can. And his most recent book is called White Too Long. The book before that is called The End of White Christianity in the United States, where white Christians are becoming a minority, which is in many ways a good thing because it shows that the society can adapt to people of different backgrounds. But what you've got is one party representing people of different backgrounds and one party that's increasingly only representing white Christians. And that's causing a lot of problems in this country. It's also causing problems in France and and in Britain and Austria And you get these leaders who are pursuing exclusivist policies. You have them in your own country. They're there in Hungary. They're there in Turkey. They're there in Israel. They're there in Austria and France. They're not elected yet in France, but right now it seems as if they have a chance of being elected in the next election. And that's really problematic. And Donald Trump wants to come back. And right now you have a situation where the majority of Republicans actually believe that Donald Trump really did win the election in 2020. I know that's tough to believe, but that's true. Do you want me just to continue, or do you want me to? You want a break? I mean, I can continue now if you'd rather.
We can continue.
Yeah. Okay. Let me move to corruption, and I'll try to do this briefly because you said you wanted to end at 11:30. That's fine. When after I've been doing some work on trust, I wanted to see what some of the consequences of trust were. And I looked at one of the really negative consequences of trust. They just appeared to me one day. And if you think about it, it makes sense, at least to me. Corruption. Corruption both stems from a lack of trust and creates a lack of trust. Do we have this graph of my model of trust somewhere?
Yes.
Your model of inequality, trust, corruption, and effective government.
This one?
That's one. That's exactly it. Yeah. So I wrote a book in 2008 called, now I can't remember, I remember the title I wanted, was on corruption. Well, it doesn't matter. And it's why there was something I called the inequality trap. And I started going from generalized trust to inequality and to corruption. In countries with low levels of generalized trust, you have generally high levels of inequality. And where you have low levels of generalized trust, you have higher levels of corruption. So again, those same countries that have high levels of generalized trust have low levels of corruption. Again, the most honest countries in the world tend to be the Nordic countries. Finland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands. And in turn, where there's a low level of corruption, there is more generalized trust. So this works reciprocally. Where there is a low level of generalized trust, particularly in former colonies and in places like Turkey and Brazil and the former communist countries, there is a high level of corruption. And a high level of corruption, in turn, leads to more inequality. Why? Because leaders steal money. And when leaders steal money, there's less to spend on programs that produce less inequality. And what do these programs include? They include hospitals, they include roads, they include all sorts of public services, and especially education. And let me just tell you a story and then get to my story on education. Leaders of three very corrupt countries met at a conference some years ago. And the leader of Indonesia showed a picture of a bridge. And he said, "You see that bridge? 50% of the cost went to me." And then a leader from one of the Latin American countries showed a picture of a bridge. And he said, "You see that bridge? 75% of what it cost to build that bridge went to me." And the leader of Nigeria showed a picture of land without a bridge. And he said, "You see that bridge?" And the other leader said, "No." He said, 100% went to me. So the idea is, where you have a lot of corruption, you have fewer government services. Ben Olken of MIT, when he was a graduate student at Harvard, got a grant to build a bridge in Indonesia. And he compared what he spent to build the bridge to what the government spent. And what he spent was about a quarter of what the government spent. And he regarded that the other 75% went to corruption. Now, the problem with that study is very simple. You can't replicate it very often. The problem with corruption is that you can't observe it. If you can observe it, you would probably, people might want to try to punish it if they could. But most of the time, people aren't in any position to punish it because of inequality. No one is going to punish Vladimir Putin, Erdogan, or many other leaders, not even Donald Trump, for their corruption. Trump may finally be convicted of something, but Putin will never go to jail. Erdogan will never go to jail. And in particular, people tend to give very little support to corrupt leaders unless they make their lives better. But here's where we have particularized trust. In many countries, leaders will reward their own groups with benefits and not other groups. This is true in a lot of the former communist countries, which will provide benefits to people who are of the majority group, but not immigrants. It's true in African countries where leaders will provide benefits to people from their own tribes, but not from other tribes. So that particularized trust can lead to corruption, which will then lead to more inequality because the favored groups or the favored leaders will get more than other people. And this indicates a real problem in terms of defining or measuring corruption. I'll just mention one other thing here. Remember, I mentioned before legal fairness can lead to less corruption, but you need trust to begin with. Okay, let's just move on, and I can just talk now for a while. What you have with corruption is a problem of both definition and measurement. You can try to define corruption, but you're probably not going to be too successful. The standard definition of corruption is taking resources from the public purse and putting it into private hands. What this doesn't do is it doesn't measure corruption among people in the private sector. It's also almost impossible to perceive corruption. So the way we perceive corruption is twofold. First, there are elite surveys. And we can get rid of this if you want. Have people here ever heard of the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International? They interview elites, and elites give estimates of the level of corruption in their society. Now, there are two problems with this method. Number one is you can only interview a small number of elites, and secondly, it's just perceptions. You can't really observe corruption. I once had a chance to participate in corruption, which is how I got interested in this. When I was 13, my father asked me to deliver an envelope to the chief of police of Paterson, New Jersey. He ran a stationery store in that town. Our family depended upon government business so that we could eat. And I delivered this envelope with a $50 bill to the police department. The chief wasn't in, but a sergeant said he would give the money, the envelope, to the chief. Half an hour later, we got a huge order from the police department. Including in that big order was an order for 30 staplers, and only 13 people worked in the State Department. So we knew what some of their kids were getting for Christmas. Now, a Christmas gift was illegal as well as a bribe, but everyone did it. And that's how I learned about corruption to begin with. I currently live in a county where the governing officials don't retire to become police chiefs or corporate lobbyists. They retire to become priests or academics. This is a very liberal, very honest, very wealthy area. So I've gone from one extreme in my life to the other in terms of where I live. But most of the time, you just can't perceive corruption directly. So you have to ask people. And the Corruption Perception Index has been used, even though it's based on small samples, because basically it's one of the best we have. Now, the World Bank has used a variety of other interviews to come up with a more aggregate index, but all these aggregate indices are very highly correlated with each other, and they all show the same thing. The most honest countries, as I said, were the Nordic countries, and the most dishonest are, anyone want to guess?
I didn't hear one more time.
Where are the most dishonest countries?
Um,
Highest levels of corruption.
Maybe the African countries.
Yep. Mali, Nigeria, Rwanda, most of the African countries. And then there's also Afghanistan, Bangladesh, countries that are poor and unequal. And this is part of what I call the inequality trap. Now, here's the problem. I don't know if we need to show the graphs. You can just disseminate them. One of the problems with do we have it? Okay, hold on. I'm not sure if it's here. Okay, don't worry about it. One of the problems with corruption is that it is very steady over time. Countries that were corrupt a long time ago are still corrupt now. There's an institute in Sweden called the VDEM Institute. I don't know if there's any of you ever heard of it. They hire, or they don't hire, they get academic volunteers who give estimates of the levels of corruption going back as far as 1900 to the present. Countries or colonies that were corrupt in 1900 are still corrupt today. So corruption is sticky and inequality is sticky. And the countries that were corrupt in 1900 had high levels of inequality. Remember I mentioned how it was measured by family farms? And inequality is sticky as well. Countries that were highly unequal in 1900 or even earlier are unequal today. And you're going to ask, can we get rid of corruption? Well, there are lots of people who have tried, and the standard way of trying is to change the government. And has that worked very well in Poland? Maybe, but I'll tell you where it hasn't worked very well. Romania, Bulgaria, much of Latin America, much of Africa. And you know why? Because when the colonial powers left, they left very poor countries. So the people in many of these African countries never had any basis to build on. The colonial powers extracted wealth and left nothing behind. There was a fascinating study by a French economist, and she showed that for every $1,000 of education that was spent in French Africa on education, how much of it was contributed by the French government? 1/2 of 1 penny. The rest had to come from the people or another group that had no money, missionaries. Which meant that not that much was ever spent on education. So here's the issue on education. You want to get rid of corruption? Educate people. There are some tables, you can just disseminate them, which show the single best predictor today of the level of corruption in a country is the mean level of education in that country in 1870. Not the mean level today. That predicts, but not as well as the mean level in 1870. What does that tell you? It tells you that people who were well educated back then continue to be well educated today. And there are very few resources because governments are stealing money or simply don't have the resources. Now, there are some countries that do change. And I'll give you several. One is a little bit different than most of the others. It's Finland. Because Finland, until basically the fall of the Soviet Union, was scared of Russia. And if you go and look at Finland, it's a wealthy country, but the University of Helsinki looks like a Russian institution. But now, Finland has probably the most highly developed education system in the world. Everyone gets educated. It's required to go to school. Teachers and parents interact as equals. Other countries that have increased education include Singapore, Korea, and Taiwan. And how did they increase their level of education? Two explanations. Number one, the increase in education was part of a political movement towards greater equality overall. In all three of these countries, education was connected to land reform. There were political movements that led people to redistribute land. And secondly, they were reactions by the leaders to a fear of external threat. In all three countries, it was fear of China. South Korea was afraid that China was going to arm North Korea. Singapore was afraid that China was going to arm the Singaporean Communist Party. And Taiwan has always been afraid that China was going to invade directly. So the idea was that these leaders wanted to maintain power. And they believed that they could not maintain power unless they had the support of some of the people in these countries. And the way to get support from people in these countries was to provide them with some services that would help them improve their lives. You go around Hong Kong, now I don't know what's going to happen now that China has taken over Hong Kong, but when I was there were signs on buses saying, if you see corruption, report it. And Hong Kong has developed, as Singapore has, as Taiwan, and as South Korea has developed, incredible systems of education. Why is education so important? If you educate people, they no longer have to rely upon corrupt leaders to provide for their bread and butter. They can go out and make a living on their own. And when they can do that, they can vote corrupt leaders out of office, if the corrupt leaders don't help them. So with both education and trust, the key factor is the overall level of education. The greater opportunity people have for education, the better off they will be. And I think I'll sort of let you have some more questions now.
Okay, do you have some questions? Feel free to ask, Professor.
So I have one question. Because you said that the country which was in the past corrupted is now corrupted also, yeah? So it's still now corrupted?
Mostly, yeah.
Because I think Poland has changed. From 90s till now, I think we are not so corrupted like in 90s, yeah? But we are, I think our country is unequal. So
Okay. Two things. There are different types of corruption, and this may account for some of it. When you go to the doctor, you probably don't have to pay the doctor. Do you have to pay the doctor to be seen earlier?
Like when I go private, I pay for.
Yeah, but do you have to pay to be seen? You know, if you have an appointment, do you have to be paid to be seen earlier than normal?
No, I don't think so. I think it was in the past because my mother said me that it was like that. That you should buy something or pay for something like to be earlier or even I don't know to be better treated. But today I don't think so.
Okay, that's called petty corruption, and that has probably decreased considerably in recent years. You don't pay. You don't pay your professors for better grades, do you?
No.
But you know what? Your parents didn't go to university, right?
No.
Or did they?
They
did?
Yeah.
Did they have to pay to get better grades?
Yeah, it was like communism.
Yeah.
So
you know how I know that? When I wrote my book on corruption, my first book on corruption, I had seen in many then former communist countries price lists for grades. If you wanted the highest grade, it cost you a certain number of zlotys. If you wanted a lower grade, it will cost you less.
Yeah, and even the Communist Party. So when you went to Communist Party,
yeah. No one ever paid me for a grade when I taught. And if they had tried to, they would have been in tremendous trouble. But it's easier to eliminate this small level of corruption than it is. Do you think your prime minister is completely honest? Well, look, Donald Trump wasn't that honest. So it's easier to eliminate petty corruption than it is grand corruption. And while Poland may be much less corrupt than it used to be, is it anywhere near the level of Norway? Probably not. The United States doesn't rank that overwhelmingly high. It ranks probably much higher than Poland, but probably much lower than some other countries. So there's still a lot of corruption, and there's still probably a fair amount of inequality in Poland. I mean, in the United States, inequality has soared in recent years. So you need to do something about inequality. And you need to perhaps have a change of government. We have a change of government here, but I have no idea how long that's going to last. The Democrats have a 4-seat majority in the House of Representatives. The Senate is tied. No one knows what's going to happen in 2022. And There are some people who are even talking about trying to reinstate Donald Trump as president. That's scary. When I say I'm terrified for my own country, I'm not being, I'm sounding a real warning sign. And one of the things that Trump did was cut a lot of funding for education, because he reviewed people like university professors as his enemies. And some Republican states drastically cut funding for universities. And they're trying to make it more difficult for people to vote. So this is not an easy situation to remedy. Because aside from a handful of countries that have become less corrupt, when Agnieszka shows these slides that I have, you will see that the graphs of corruption over time in most countries remain relatively similar. This is why I talk about an inequality trap. Some places escape it, but most don't. And this is, the notion that the past matters comes from a very famous economist, Douglas North. Do you know of him? He wrote a book in which he talked about something called path dependence, which is what happens in the past has a huge influence about what happens now. And it's difficult to overcome what happened in the past. He won a Nobel Prize for that. Small contribution.
Thank you. We have one more question from Mafa, please.
Yes, I would like to ask a question. I wrote it down one moment. I wanted to ask, how can you build trust in countries that had a system of division, for example, apartheid, a country like that, South Africa? Like, where would you start, Professor, if now there is an additional division amongst the same race due to difference of wealth and due to corruption that has grown within the government? So where do you start building the trust in the society?
Well, if you can find some way to create greater levels of education, that's the way you start. South Africa is a particularly difficult case, but increasing numbers of Black Africans are getting educated and getting income. But it's going to be a very, very long process because the situation there is very, very difficult. I think that's probably one of the more difficult places in the world. I think it's going to take a long time for this to work itself out. I'm not optimistic in the short term, unfortunately.
Okay, Firat.
Hello. I want to ask a question. Actually, this topic is not my research area, but it will just catch my attention, and I wanted to ask a question. You say that there is like two types of corruption, but you didn't open it. Could you please open it? Actually, what is the difference of this corruption types, and what you mean by that exactly? And I also wanted to ask, is there something to do with the geography?
Okay, good question.
I mean,
And
like,
where are you from?
oh, sorry?
Where are you from?
I am Kurdish from east part of Turkey.
Okay.
Because I have when I was listening all this class, and I had kind of thinking about from my location, yes, the place that I came from. It's kind of, when it comes to corruption, of course, poverty is very important. You already mentioned about this, and education is one of the key aspects, in my opinion. In such countries that I am coming from, this is kind of, the corruption is happening from the, in my opinion, from the state of nature. It's about to pull off one from another. Those who is able to get it, let's say.
Okay.
And I see it like this. I mean, when it comes to US is a more economically developed, at least. I mean, I don't know actually, like, how is the middle class, lower class incoming, but anyway, it is better than many other rest of the countries. Yes, the corruption of US and US economy and education is also good. I mean, we can't comparing the other, at least on the picture we can see like that, right? um, what is that? I mean, how do you evaluate this? It is kind of paradox for me actually here.
Okay. First, you have asked for some of the distinctions between types of corruption. Grand corruption is corruption on a big scale. It's what leaders engage in. Petty corruption is when you have to make small payments to get things done, to get to see the doctor, to get a good grade, to get government services, to avoid a fine if you speed on the highway. And so that's the difference between grand and petty corruption. Now, is there a geographical basis? There is a literature by a guy named Stanley Engerman who argues that something called factor endowments matter. And what factor endowments are is a country's geography. Is it hot? Is it cold? And my friend Chris Welsel in Germany also argues that countries with cold climates are more honest. Well, yes and no. And the reason why there's some yes is that many countries which have resources like oil and mines, that stuff can be stolen by leaders. This is what's called a resource curse. But there are other countries that have resources like Norway. Norway's got a tremendous amount of oil, but it's not stolen in Norway. So the idea that simply having these resources is sufficient to create corruption, I think, is wrong. And I'll give you one other explanation for this. I'll give you a country that's hot, that used to be corrupt, but overcame corruption. Singapore. So the fact that you have hot weather is not a guarantee that you'll have corruption. Now, how do you get rid of it? Not easy. You need a political movement. You have that in Turkey. You have it in Poland. You have part of it in the United States. But it takes a long, long time. And it may not always be easily successful. What else can I say here?
Okay, any other questions? Firat? No?
Well, of course, as I said, I can't see it from different angles to make it more specific for myself. But I don't know. Like for me, it was like kind of also state of nature. Like when you are in the natural state, there is no rule and everything, and you are just pulling off from the other. So of course, this is the result of the economic issue and poverty, I would say. But I can't go very deeper. I'm sorry. Thank you very much for answering my question. I really appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, dear Rick, thank you very much for your lecture. All comments, in particular about Poland, they were very interesting here. And it was our great pleasure hosting you here at our webinar. Thank you.
Okay. I'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah, see you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I guess you got my email and you can always contact me.
Okay, thank you.